and welcome to Crime Bytes, the show where we talk about some truly bizarre and disturbing crime cases. My name is Liz, and today is True Crime Tuesday. So it's Halloween in 2 days. Happy early Halloween for anyone who celebrates. I'll be hitting the streets with my son and my bull terrier. We're going as target workers this year. I'm just hoping Scoot does well and that we all have fun. So I thought that I would look at another case that took place on Halloween, and this case is going to take us to Greenwich, Connecticut in the 70s. It's loosely connected to the Kennedys as well, so yeah. But before we do that, let's pause for a quick promotion. Your promotion here. No promotion this week. Anyhow, we're going to start today's story by meeting Dorothy Moxley. Dorothy was not having a good night. It was the night before Halloween, and Dorothy was really starting to get worried. It was a little past 10 o'clock, and her daughter Martha should have been home by now. She had most certainly told her 10, and her brother John was home already. Now, back then on the night before Halloween, kids would go around and do little pranks in the neighborhood, like toilet papering trees. Not quite as innocent things like throwing eggs at cars and houses, but they would call it mischief night or cabbage night from where I'm from, and I had to Google why. It makes sense. Kids actually would throw cabbages at houses. Cabbages. I don't know, what would that do? Smell funny? I haven't had cabbage in forever, I guess, so I guess that's better than eggs, but still. Anyhow, Martha was supposed to be grounded that evening, but over the course of the day, she had worn her mother down, and since it was mischief night and everyone was out doing things, Dorothy reluctantly agreed. Martha was ecstatic and promised to be home by 10, and now it was midnight, and still no Martha. She would send Martha's brother John out, but he would return with no Martha and no word of where Martha would be. So Dorothy decided to call all of Martha's friends to see if they knew where she might be. Keep in mind, we're on landlines here in 1975, so there's literally no way to contact Martha or anyone who's not at their house. Anyone remember that? Anyhow, from these calls, Dorothy was able to gather that one of Martha's close friends had seen her at the Skakel house. The Skakels were Dorothy's neighbors. Dorothy's neighbors who were related to the Kennedys. Because Rushton Skakel, the head of that household, had a sister who was married to Robert F. Kennedy, JFK's brother. Dorothy would call the Skakel household next, and she wouldn't actually get to speak to her friend Rushton because he was out on a hunting trip. Instead, his 18-year-old daughter Julie would answer the phone, and she would tell Dorothy that Martha had already left and that her brother Tommy, who Martha was reportedly last seen with, was already in bed. Tommy was last seen with Martha in their yard, falling behind the fences. So Martha was last seen at the Skakel's house, which was literally right next door, and she definitely still wasn't there. And she definitely wasn't home either, so where was she? She wasn't even frustrated anymore, she was just worried, and she would call the Skakel house back and ask to speak to Tommy, who would roll out of bed and tell her he had no idea where the hell Martha was. Great kid. After that, Dorothy would just call the police, and it was right around 4 in the morning at that point, and she reported her daughter missing. Exhausted and out of options, she would fall asleep on the couch by the window where she hoped Martha would attempt to sneak back in at any moment. But that never happened, and Dorothy slowly roused the next morning and kind of looked to the window for any sign of disturbance, or in this case, hope, but it didn't look like anything had changed. She headed up to Martha's room, praying she would somehow still find her daughter tucked in bed safe, that she somehow had snuck back in the past few hours past her, but her bed was still completely empty, and the fear that overtook her in the night before came back stronger than ever. But nothing too horrible could have happened to Martha, right? They were in Belhaven in Greenwich in a 500-acre gated community that was peppered with mansions. Horrible things didn't happen here. It was 10 a.m. now, and she had managed to drift away for a couple hours, and the police had their eyes out for Martha, but there was still no sign of her. So Dorothy decided to head over to the Skakel house to see if she could learn anything that way. And when she did, Michael Skakel would answer the door. Rushton had a total of 7 children, and Michael was actually the one who was Martha's age. Tommy was 2 years older than her. Michael actually looked a little hungover, and he would say that he hadn't seen Martha since the night before. He would let Dorothy check out the camper that they had parked out in their yard just in case, but unfortunately there was still no Martha. At this point, the police and half the neighborhood were out looking for Martha, and Dorothy was exhausted and out of hope. She would return home and allow a couple of her friends to stay with her for comfort, just kind of silently begging Martha to walk through her door. And instead, Martha's friend Sheila would walk through the door looking like she had seen a ghost. And she may as well have. Right in her own yard, just under the big pine tree, lay Dorothy's daughter Martha, dead. It was every mother's worst fear realized, and just like that, time stopped for her. Martha was so caked in blood that you couldn't even tell what her hair color was anymore. Her head was literally bashed in, and the murder weapon was still mostly left at the scene. It was a 6-iron gold club, and whoever had murdered Martha had used so much force that they broke the club into 4 pieces, then drove one of the pieces into her neck. It was clearly done by someone with a lot of anger. It was determined she was struck in the back of the head while she was walking up her driveway, then dragged under the pine tree where the attack continued. The killer would pull Martha's pants and underwear down, but there was no sign that a sexual assault had occurred. Almost as if whoever did it was more curious at that point. At this point, all Dorothy wanted was justice, but that would not come swiftly. At first, the police were able to narrow it down to 3 suspects, but again with this case, just like last week's case, literally everyone is lying and saying whatever they need to suit themselves best, so it's a lot harder to find the truth about what occurred. So we obviously have at least one, if not more, guilty parties and or some sort of cover-up, even if it's just trying to take the focus off the killer, and we'll get to all of that. But I guess let's start with the original account that everyone gave of what happened that night. Initially, Rushton Skakel was cooperative with law enforcement. He allowed them to look around. He was maybe even a little too friendly, if you catch my drift. The golf club used to kill Martha was determined to have come from a set in his house, and his house was the last place that Martha was seen alive at. But he was on a hunting trip that weekend. So, who killed Martha? That evening, Martha would come over with a few of their friends from the neighborhood, and they would hop into a car at the Skakels to listen to the radio. She was kind of in between the 2 brothers, Tommy and Michael, and they were all kind of joking around and having fun. At some point, 2 of the older Skakels came to use the car to go across town to their cousin's house, at which point Tommy and Martha would hop out and Michael would stay along for the ride. So Tommy would say that around 9:30, right after Martha's friend had seen him with Martha, Martha would go home and he would go up to his room to work on a homework assignment that he had about Abraham Lincoln. After that, he would watch part of a movie with the family's new live-in tutor, Kenneth Littleton. It was actually Kenneth's first day working for the Skakels. Obviously, that would put him under question as well, and it did. Kenneth Littleton had actually arrived in his red Mustang that afternoon to interview for the job as a live-in tutor, and he was offered the job on the spot. He was eating an extravagant dinner with the children at around 6 that night, after which he would settle in to watch the premiere of The French Connection. He would report that Tommy would join him to watch the chase scene. He would claim not to find out about Martha being missing until the next morning. Michael Skakel would also be questioned, but he would state that he had left with his older brothers, Rushton Jr. and John, when they went to go watch the movie with their cousin Jimmy, and that he hadn't returned until around 11:20 that evening. So all three main suspects had an alibi, per se anyhow, and so the case went cold for almost 25 years. Yes, I'm serious. But during those 25 years, Dorothy would not give up looking for justice for her daughter. In the meantime, Rushton would fire Kenneth when his older children received failing marks in school, and he would go on to have a drug and alcohol-fueled weekend where he stole over $4,000 worth of goods from a shop and a boat. He threw a cinder block through the shop window as well. Needless to say, these antics piqued the interest of detectives who decided to question him further about the killing. This would ultimately cause him to lose the job that he found teaching in an elite school in New Canaan, and he would go on to have issues with drinking and attempting to hold down part-time jobs. He was, however, as cooperative as he could be in any way that he could to try and help solve the case, despite feeling pressured all along to confess to a crime he says he absolutely did not commit. He claims to never have even met Martha Moxley. In 1978, Michael Skakel would get arrested for drunk driving and get sent up to the Elon School in Poland Spring, Maine, where he would be treated for his alcoholism. While he was there, it is reported that he told a classmate that he was going to get away with murder because he was a Kennedy. What? In 1991, Rushton Skakel would hire private investigators to clear his family's name, because although the case had gone cold, people were still whispering about the Skakels, and having their name cleared was important to them. When the investigators went to speak to Tommy and Michael, both would end up changing their stories about what happened that evening. So Tommy, instead of writing a paper that they found out was never assigned to him about Abraham Lincoln, claimed to have engaged in some heavy petting with Martha after witnesses saw them fall behind the fence in their backyard. Then he would say Martha went home and that he went to watch some of that movie with his tutor Kenneth. He still had that part of his alibi, and after that he went to bed. Michael would state that instead of going to the movie, he would get drunk, go over to the tree where Martha was ultimately found, look into her window, and jerk off. Yeah, he admitted to that. So what's interesting to me about this is both boys changed their stories. Not only that, both boys changed their stories to a tune that would explain away any DNA evidence of that nature if it were to later be found and analyzed. So think about that. I mean, well played. Obviously being nervous and embarrassed comes into play, but at this point, what and who do you believe? Michael also had witnesses saying that he went to the movie, witnesses saying that he didn't. Who do you believe? In 1992, investigators would attempt to get Kenneth Littleton's ex-wife to wear a wire and get him to implicate himself for Martha's murder, but that was not successful. He would not confess to the crime he claims not to have committed. In 1996, there was an Unsolved Mysteries episode about the case, which fueled a bunch of calls, some of them about the things that Michael Skakel was going around Elon School saying. And in 1998, Mark Furman, the detective who worked OJ's case, would publish a book entitled Murder in Greenwich, and literally named Michael Skakel as the murderer, then pointed out numerous mistakes that were made in the initial investigation. Then, in 1998, a one-man grand jury was convened to re-examine the evidence, and Littleton ended up being granted immunity for giving his testimony about the Skakels on record. 18 months later, they decided that they had enough evidence to arrest Michael Skakel. He He was arraigned for murder in a juvenile court because he and Martha were 15 when she was murdered, but the judge ruled that he would be tried as an adult. There would be 13 other witnesses from Elon's school who heard him make incriminating statements about killing Martha and would testify against him. So did Michael do it, or was he just bragging about something as a stupid teenager? The Skakel brothers would liken his trial to a witch hunt. So was it a witch hunt, or did Michael really brag about a crime he committed and then people went and then testified about it? In August of 2002, Michael Skakel was finally convicted of Martha Moxley's murder and received a sentence of 20 years to life. Robert Kennedy Jr. would become involved and pretty outspoken about the subject and claim his cousin Michael was convicted simply because somebody decided a Skakel was going to jail, and that all of the other evidence, the abundant evidence against other people, was just going to be ignored. But that's simply not the case. As we already mentioned, Kenneth Littleton was investigated and ultimately given immunity, but he was investigated more than thoroughly. There were other claims and theories that were also investigated, one coming from a neighborhood friend, Tony Bryant, who said that he had two friends visiting him from the Bronx that weekend who had picked up golf clubs from the Skakel's yard that night and started swinging them around, and then they said they were going to go out and get a girl caveman style. Tony didn't want any part of it and told them as much and left. When he found out about Martha, he feared the worst but didn't ask any questions, even when his friends were almost bragging to him, stating, "We accomplished our mission." So if this account is true, obviously it would exonerate Michael Skakel. This testimony would come about through a letter to Robert Kennedy from a friend of Tony's who obviously was hoping that Robert could get the ball rolling and doing something about it. And when they reached out to Tony 28 years later, his story didn't change. He would claim that his mother had told him, as one of the only colored kids in the area, that he should keep his mouth shut to avoid drawing attention to himself, which I guess makes sense for that area in the 70s. Both of the boys named were ultimately tracked down and, of course, denied any part of the murder. Then in 2013, Michael Skakel was granted a new trial and released on $1.2 million bail. And why? Because he claimed that his counsel had been inadequate. He hired attorney Michael Sherman, then claimed that he got too distracted by his prestige. You know, he was a Kennedy and all. Too much limelight. This actually worked and he was out. Then in 2016, the Connecticut Supreme Court would rule to reinstate the conviction, but would reverse that decision in 2018 and would order a new trial. Then on October 30th of 2020, literally on the 45th anniversary of Martha's murder, Connecticut announced that they would not retry Skakel. That's that. He served only 10 years. But was he guilty? What do you guys think? This one is so tricky because he maintains his innocence and there's enough questions that can ultimately possibly lead to another killer. I don't know, in the end I think it was Michael, but I wouldn't be able to sit on a jury and say that without a reasonable doubt though. So yeah. Did any of you guys think Tommy or Kenneth Littleton did it? Or one of those two boys from the city, if that story was accurate? Do you think Michael did it? I think this one is tricky because it happened so long ago, and without any conclusive evidence, you could really make a good case for any of these suspects. The state ultimately decided not to retry the case because they felt that it couldn't be proved beyond a reasonable doubt, and I feel they're absolutely correct about that at this point, unfortunately. Earlier this year, Michael brought his own lawsuit against the lead investigator and the town of Greenwich for malicious prosecution and violation of his constitutional rights. So we'll see if anything happens with that. I just feel feel so horrible for Dorothy Moxley. I'm actually going to make her my positive highlight for today, for her perseverance and grace throughout this horrible ordeal. She never gave up fighting for justice for her daughter, but she also just has been an incredible example through that of grace in a horrible situation. I'm going to play a quick clip of her being interviewed about her position, both as a mother of a murder victim and as someone in a very high-profile case.
The connection is very small. It's just that Ethel Kennedy is their aunt. And the rest of the Kennedys are not involved at all. So, I mean, this really is not a Kennedy thing, even though they get dragged into it all the time, and I feel badly about that. But that's just life, I guess. Yeah. But I do, I know there are many mothers and fathers of murdered children out there who have spent have spent their life now trying to solve their case. And their life savings, and nobody cares. And I have been so blessed. I mean, I have had these, I call them my angels, who all of a sudden, if you can imagine Dominic
Say that to
Dunn,
the politicians, yeah.
Dominic Dunn is an angel, and Mark Furman is an angel, and Tim Dumas is an angel. But, they've just come to me.
I think that's an interesting take on it. She truly never gave up fighting for her daughter, and people kept showing up to keep fighting with her. I like how she calls them angels. She is disappointed in the court's decision not to retry the case, stating she knows in her heart that he did it. In her words,
well, the murder weapon came from the Skakel house, and that was the last place she was seen alive. After a few months, they stopped cooperating. And why would you stop cooperating if you didn't have something to hide? And then in the last few years, since about 1994, we have been able to talk to people who have gone to rehab centers with Michael. And we found out more about his personality.
But just her ability to be so polite and dignified. I don't think I'd have that in me in her situation. I feel for her so much. But guys, I wish you a very safe and happy Halloween. Again, if you do participate, be safe, be smart, don't hurt anybody. Oh, and if you like this spooky story and you want to hear another, click the link here to hear last year's story about a real-life Candyman. And don't forget to leave your comments and your opinions about today's case, and subscribe if you haven't already. All right, see you next week. Bye.